Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's webinar. It's the third one in our Digital Week series. Well, digitalization can be overwhelming at times. All the opportunities, challenges, risks, additional resources we need. How can we make the most of it for our companies? And might design thinking be of help here? My name is Friederike Rieder, and I'm very happy to have a renowned design thinking expert with me today, Professor Falk Uebernickel. He will be joining us from Potsdam, where he is Professor of Design Thinking and Innovation Research at the Hasso-Plattner Institute. In addition, he's also professor at the HSG, and he has been at HSG for 16 years. So Falk, would you like to turn on your camera and audio? Welcome, Falk.
Sure, welcome, Friederike.
Before we start, just two remarks for those viewers who are joining us for the first time today. Please use the F&A or Q&A field in your Zoom program to ask your questions, type in your questions, and we will discuss these after the presentation. The presentation itself will last around 30 minutes. Also, we will record the session and distribute the link to the recording and also to the slide next week. So, Falk, thank you so much for joining us and for stepping in super short term for Jennifer, who's unfortunately sick today. So I'd say I hand over to you, Falk, and I wish you, dear viewers, an insightful lunch break.
Yeah, thank you, Friederike, for the brief introduction, and welcome everyone from around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And it's a great pleasure for me to be part of this series and to talk about design thinking and digitization today. In order to do so, I'm now trying to turn on my slide deck, and just to let you know, all the slides that I will present, we will share afterwards to you. So don't worry, you definitely get access to them. And the topic for today is realizing the full potential of digitization with design thinking. I think that's a great or a massive pitch for design thinking. And what I'm trying to do in the next 20-30 minutes while I'm talking is to introduce you to two approaches how design thinking might support you in your organizational challenges to get a bit closer to the objectives around digitization. But before I start, I really want to pay some credit to my colleague who can't make it here today, because some of you might have clicked and joined this webinar because of Jennifer. But unfortunately, she stayed the last week in India, and when she traveled back from India to Europe, she got sick. She's now recovering, so don't worry. But therefore, I got informed on very short notice yesterday, and I said, yes, I take over. So I pay credit to Jennifer, and everything I say, she would have said definitely in the same way. So let's maybe start with a quick survey in the beginning to activate you a bit, and also to give me a chance to understand what the level of knowledge is. So how would you level yourself in regard to your design thinking knowledge? And I see a lot of people are now voting, so it's interesting. So never heard about it is around 10%. I participated in the training 21, heard about it 56, so the far majority. We give you a couple more seconds. Okay, so now the results are official. Thank you for participating. So as I said, the far majority with 54% are just heard about it, and then 2% have reached the guru status. So that's awesome. So welcome as well. And some of you have also involved into a project. Okay, so that gives me a first impression. Thanks. So before I start with the details around design thinking and how it can contribute to digitization efforts in organizations, I would like to spend 3 slides on the history, because especially the ones who just voted for I heard about it, they might not know the entire context of design thinking. When I'm trying to explain design thinking, then I usually start with one picture showing Stanford University, because it's, at least in the literature, one of the hubs that is claimed to be the origin for design thinking. And design thinking itself as a method and as a spectrum of different tools and mindsets is not very new and not brand new. It originates back to the 1968s, 1970s, basically. And it firstly appeared in the context of mechanical engineering at Stanford University. And the reason why it appeared is pretty simple explained, because at that time, most of the engineers were educated mostly around the question how to build systems. So electrical systems or mechanical systems. But what was missing at that time was an educational approach to teach young students all the questions around why. So not only how do we build systems, but why do we need them? What is the purpose for them? And the belief of the professors at that time was that only if students are able to understand the why questions, they will become better engineers, and they can answer also in a better way the how questions. And this was basically the starting point for what we call design thinking nowadays, because at this time, the lecturers from the mechanical engineering department, they reached out to psychologists, to their colleagues in marketing, but also to ethnographers, to build up a separate or a parallel curriculum to educate young students with all the why-related questions. And especially in the beginning of design thinking, some famous products were designed with this tool set and methodology. One to mention definitely is the first mouse from Apple. The founder of, or one of the founders from IDEO, David Kelly, was involved into this specific project. But also if you look at other stunning products from Apple, like the first iMac, is a sparking example for applying design thinking and human-centered design on technical products. Because the great feature, maybe some of you might remember the product presentation by Steve Jobs for this specific product. The specific product feature was basically that they got rid of all the cables. All the computers before, they had thousands of cables. So for the monitor, for the main computer engine, but also for the keyboards, etc. And the team at Apple observed that this is a huge hindering point in households to place the computer more in the center of the house. And therefore, they redesigned, with the help of design thinking, this computer engine. Later on, also more difficult products like satellites were redesigned, and also more simpler products like ice scoop spoons were redesigned based on design thinking. So, but it didn't stop there. Nowadays, design thinking is widely used among different communities. One example here shown on the left-hand side is coming from Airbnb. It has been used for this particular startup because what maybe some of you don't know is that Airbnb was not always a success. Especially in the beginning, they had, as many other startups at that time, struggles to understand the customer and to design their product specifically to customer needs. And only when they got in contact with one representative from a venture capital company, they learned more about design thinking, and later on they applied it to their software platform and redesigned it in a way that it really differentiated from other platforms doing the same business approach at that time. So design thinking is nowadays very widely used in a startup setting, especially when we talk about digitization. But also traditionally minded companies are now trying to catch up with this method. Like in this example on the right-hand side, this is one of the newer articles published on February 11th, 2020, about Georg Fischer. So Georg Fischer is a Swiss company specialized in piping technologies. And over the last 5 to 6 years, they have been using design thinking widely to stay competitive in the market by reinventing their existing service portfolio where they are already excellent globally with new ideas and to even move more towards the direction of digital service offerings around their piping systems. So when we look at design thinking nowadays, it's not just something for the engineering industry or for fancy startups. At least from my personal experience, I can confess that and guarantee that design thinking has a lot of impact already in large organizations, no matter what industries they have been working in. So, and just to pay credit to at least one person, where I had the pleasure to work with him together over the last 10, 12 years at Stanford University. He's Professor Larry Leifer, and he's one of the founding members, so to say, of this method spectrum. And to my own surprise, even with being almost 80 years old, he's still active and has still his full curiosity left. So if you Google him, I think you will find a lot more information about the origins of design thinking as well. So let's talk a bit about design thinking itself and what it is, especially in differentiation to other methods. So, and I would like to start with a simple graphic to explain it. And what you at the moment see in the middle is the area of familiarity. So this is what someone or a team or an organization usually knows about a given topic. So in this area, in this bandwidth, everything is basically obvious and can be thought through and can also be managed through given project methodologies in a very good way. So what we also very often observe as a core capability in large organization is the second part of the graphic, the converging part. So in a lot of cases, I see organizations having a particular idea, and then these organizations, especially through a lot of efficiency initiatives that they have been running through over the last couple of years, they have trained themselves to be an organization who's excellent in converging behavior. And that means if you have an idea here, these organizations are very good in nailing down and making a product out of it. But what they are sometimes, or in a lot of cases that I saw by myself, lack of is the third part of that graphic. It's the diverging ability. And diverging in that context means to discover new ideas and to move away from this existing area of familiarity into something that's unknown. And especially when you look into old, traditional, established organizations, it's quite stunning to see that not much effort is usually being paid for this diverging part to better understand what should be done in the future, instead of already focusing on how do we make it happen. So this you can already relate to what I said in the beginning. This converging part is mostly related to the how question, and that's a typical form of existing corporate thinking. And the why aspect is covering the diverging part and the search for the real problems and the search for customer needs. And this is what we relate to design thinking nowadays. So let's look a bit deeper into the 3 phases that you can observe in the field. So one phase of design thinking is more related to a philosophy. So especially when you talk to people like Larry Leifer, they would say design thinking is not a process, it's not a tool, it's a philosophy how you work, and it's also a mindset how you work. We will come back to that bubble later on as well. Then we have another domain, which is believing that design thinking is, beside the mindset, also a process. So it can be framed in certain steps and structures, so in order to enhance project work. And thirdly, we see people arguing that design thinking can also be seen as a tool set, which is helping existing processes to empathize in a better way with users and with customers. So when you go back to the field and when you talk to people who are more familiar with design thinking, you will find all these 3 different phases as interpretations. So we generally define design thinking then as a human-centered method for solving a certain kind of problems, and we call them wicked and or ill-defined problems of the real world for product, services, processes, and business models. And what's interesting is that we have learned over the years that design thinking is not just being used for business to consumer products, as I've been showing in the beginning, but we solve more and more also business to business problems with this method. Just to make it clear here again, we believe that this is a method, so not just a workshop format. So approach 1, so how can it help you to accelerate your digital transformation? And as I've said in the beginning, I would like to introduce you to 2 approaches. There are definitely more, but I think the 2 are, for most of you, helpful. And approach number 1 is more referring to design thinking seen as a tool set. And the first tool that I strongly recommend for all of you working in startups or in corporations is the need finding tool. And in this particular picture, you see 2 members of my team conducting field research for around digital services for rural pharmacies in Kenya. So in this particular case, we have been working together with Merck, a pharmaceutical company in Germany, on an issue. And in order to understand and act out the diverging phase that I have explained earlier, we use need finding to go out in the field and basically to leave the corporate doors first in order to talk to customers, users, but also to any other stakeholder who might be involved into the issue and later into the solution. And the intention is to gain empathy for the outside world and also to challenge our own assumptions that we have. Because in a lot of cases, I see that companies have a lot of good ideas, but based on their own assumption set. They have never challenged their own assumptions with customers and clients. And this might lead with a certain likelihood at the end of the day to a product failure after a long implementation phase. So in order to avoid these product failures after investing a lot of time and energy of your team, you should better spend a dedicated time in the beginning out in the field to talk to the 3 groups in order to better understand what the needs are. Another tool that can be used as part of the need finding are customer journeys. And I guess a lot of you have heard about that tool because large consultancies are pushing it forward quite much at the moment. But just to explain it a bit in more detail, this is obviously an example for Porsche clients. And the customer journey is helping you to get into the shoes of your client and to understand how they perceive certain processes. So in comparison, what organizations usually do is they usually depict their own individual processes, but they never try to understand what the customer process looks like and how it feels to the customer. And customer journeys, like in that example, are helping you to depict what a customer feels over years, for example, or you can also frame it over a week or over a day. And based on these customer journeys, you are then able to identify much quicker opportunity fields coming from the customer perspective. So it's helping you to bring in an additional customer focus in all of the projects that you are doing. The third tool that I would like to emphasize a bit more in this context is around prototyping. And I know the word prototype is also all around, but I would like to focus, especially here in this presentation, on low fidelity prototypes. And to give you a gut feeling how it looks, so low fidelity prototype is a very simplistic form of an intended solution, trying to make a certain critical function haptical so that you can test it afterwards with your client. And here in that picture on the left-hand side, you see a kind of wristband with a QR code and a probe reagency, also with a QR code. And the intention here was to improve data reliability in hospitals. So instead of trying to implement already an existing system, we just prototyped the wristband, we prototyped QR text that we put on the reagencies, and we prototyped a quick form of digital interface on a smartphone. So this took us maybe half a day to do. And with this prototype, we were able to just go out in the field and to test with patients in this case, but also with medical doctors and nurses in hospitals. Another example from the field is shown on these two pictures on the right-hand side. Maybe you can see it. So this is an iPhone, an old iPhone fixed with some straps to the head. And we simulated with that prototype a new form of remote maintenance activities. And as you all know, there are these Google glasses or Magic Leap glasses or Microsoft HoloLens glasses available right now. But you know, to build the prototype of these lenses is still quite time consuming. So it usually requires you a couple of weeks until you have done something. But if you want to be quicker, you would use low fidelity prototypes like this one here, just to simulate, maybe not on the same granularity level, but to simulate certain functions and to be much quicker in order to test. And another form that can be used as part of the prototyping is this Wizard of Oz concept. It's quite fun and easier to see on the right-hand side picture. So what we very often do is to fake experiences, to test these. So we invite people to our lab, and as you can see, someone is here somehow hidden under the desk, and for sure this is a very early lab test, so not the standard, but it shows nicely how we deal with complex situations. So instead of implementing a complex backend system, for example, with AI functionality, so artificial intelligence functionality, we replace the artificial intelligence by a human being. Because in most of the cases, human beings are smart, so they can deal with a lot of problems, especially in the prototyping phase. And if we then identify that this prototype has a certain level of potential, to move on with it, we then start looking into the digital parts as well. But usually we try to be as analog as possible in the beginning. So just to show you some real-life examples, this was a project that we have done in 2018-2019 with RWE. It's a bigger German utility. And as you can see, when we talk about prototypes, we do not just refer to one, but every bubble here in that chart is representing basically one low fidelity prototype. So here we have 36 low fidelity prototypes been done in the first part of the project in order to discover and to diverge what's been needed from a customer point of view. And just to show you another example, here we have been working together with a Swiss bank. Again, we prototyped a lot of critical functions as smaller, low fidelity prototypes. And the arrows are indicating some connections between the different prototypes. So the framing of the word prototype is a bit different than usual, because when we talk about low fidelity prototyping, we usually refer to 30-40 prototypes that we built in such a project. So, and this is been shown in this chart again. So the x-axis is indicating time. So that's a project basically. And the y-axis is indicating the fidelity level of your prototypes from low to high. And what we are trying to do in a project when we're still in the diverging phase, we are trying to build as many as possible low fidelity prototypes over a quite prolonged period of time. And then as soon as we have understood the problem space, and as soon as we see a certain kind of solution as a really valuable one from a customer point of view, we then start increasing the fidelity. And the first phase is there in order to experiment, to understand, empathize, and to communicate. And then later on, we check more about the feasibility aspects and the viability aspects. And to boil it down to more structures, the first phases are around critical functions, and then in the later stages, we focus on systems. So just a quick reminder, I already see some questions dropping in, so we have already 5. But for those who have questions, please put them in the chat function. Friederike will collect them and consolidate them for the afterwards Q&A session. So don't be shy, just put your questions in the chat window, and at the end, I will try to answer most of them. So let's move on with the second approach, implementing design thinking as a process and mindset to tackle wicked and ill-defined problems. So in here, I think it's important to quickly talk about what we mean with creativity. And our standard definition for creativity in business is, on one hand side, an idea needs to have a kind of original factor. So if it's not new, if it has no novelty, it's definitely not referred as being creative. But beside this novelty factor, it also needs to have a purpose. But the purpose is just established and given by the customer or any stakeholder who's related to the product idea. And to frame the creativity thing, again, in another framework, a 2x2 matrix. On the x-axis, we have usefulness from low to high, and on the y-axis, novelty of a product, so originality, also from low to high. And this helps us to identify 4 different types of products. On one hand side, repeating past mistakes. So this is what you should avoid. Unfortunately, I see a lot of them. Then if novelty is low, but the usefulness is high, we are usually referring to utilitarian products. So like kitchen machines or drawers or washing machines could fall into this category. If the novelty is high, but the usefulness is low, we are talking about fads. So, and one is definitely the Tamagotchi, for example, right? So it had a novelty factor, but I think it didn't serve any purpose for our society or on a long-term scale. So then we have the creative products with a high novelty and high usefulness. So why is that important when we are talking about the implementation thing of design thinking? It's important because if you remember back the three phases that I was depicting in the beginning, then you can also overlay the three phases of DT on this chart. So what we usually see is that this tool set can be widely used of design thinking for enhancing utilitarian products. So it's definitely been helpful also in traditional project management approaches and R&D approaches. So the process is somewhere in between that you have to build up. So if you want to be able to redesign or design creative products in the future, you need to have a certain understanding of the design thinking process. And for sure, if you want to have this, or if you want to create creative products more sustainable, so on an ongoing base, you need to be able to implement design thinking as a mindset in your organization or in parts of your organization. So let's do another Q&A before we move on, because Scrum will be of importance. So let's do another quick question. So what is your experience level on Scrum? So answers are dropping in. Heard about it is almost the same level again, so 50%. But more gurus, 12%. Yeah, so many more people have been trained. So my rough estimate is, yeah, so 44% have been trained and also, or then even involved into projects. So interesting. Okay, thank you for participating. So why is it important? Because Scrum is one of the methods that I would put in the converging corner of the discussion that I led before. And in order to understand the implementation of design thinking, I would like to showcase this together with Scrum. So how do we do that? If you look at design thinking and at Scrum, as I said in the beginning, the design thinking is more in the diverging part, and Scrum is an implementation method. Scrum basically comes from the software industry, and they have been using Scrum since many years, so since over a decade already, in order to enhance software implementation projects and to become more flexible. On this chart, what you see is on the left-hand side, one of the design thinking projects, basically starting by defining a problem, need finding, we talked about this, ideation, prototyping, and testing. And then on the right-hand side, you see what Scrum basically is. You have usually a backlog consisting of all the requirements that the product owner has given to the project that needs to be implemented in the software. Then you have a dedicated sprint backlog. Then you have a sprint called building phase, you have a test, and you have a retrospective phase. So, but how is this, or how can these two circles be combined? And what we have found most useful in the past is to look at it from two different perspectives. On one hand side, we use design thinking to explore the problem space as described earlier. And as soon as we have prototype and tested solutions that are valuable to customers, then we usually hand over these tested prototypes as part of a requirement specification to Scrum teams. So then it's part of the product owner to prioritize the functions that need to be implemented in the next cycles and next loops. But this is definitely one handover process that happens between design thinking related teams and Scrum teams. So the handover point is, for those who know Scrum, described as tested prototypes. We are usually here not talking about MVPs, minimal viable products. They're here on that end. So they are basically outcomes of a Scrum process. So what is the second perspective? The second perspective is this arrow on top, which is referring back from the Scrum team to the design thinking team. And this is critical as well, because sometimes sometimes you implement functions that have been specified as tested prototypes, but while you implement them, while you're on the go, you realize that you still need to discover even more of the problem space. So this is basically happening by the doing process. So when you do something, you even think further beyond, and then you realize that you might have missed something. And therefore, we sometimes realize that as part of the testing, we need to go back to the design thinking team, and they need to solve a dedicated part of this Scrum problem, again, with this design thinking toolset. So what does that imply? So the basic message is that in a good implementation approach, we usually see both implemented. Scrum, with a strong focus on converging and implementing features, but design thinking is being used to understand what the customer needs, what the problem space looks like. So especially the product owners are being involved into these teams. And then based on the findings, we specify explicitly backlog requirements. So, and to finalize, especially if you want to follow on with approach 2, it's not just important to look at this process level, but what you also need to implement in your organization is a certain kind of behavior and mindset that you have to have as an organization and team. First of all, again, it's relating back to one of the tools. You need to be human-centered. So as soon as you are trying to deal with a new problem, with a creative problem, you need to have the customer in mind. And from my personal experience, it's usually not enough to conduct corporate internal interviews. From my own experience, you really have to go out and you have to expose yourself to clients and stakeholders. You also have to facilitate this culture of prototyping. So instead of procrastinating on things or trying to build from the beginning on large-scale prototypes, you should facilitate a culture of low-fidelity prototyping, and to check back regularly also with the top management with the low-fidelity prototypes. This is, on the other hand, increasing the amount of needed radical collaboration between the different departments, because in order to be able to go out and also to prototype, you need to bring together in such a team different disciplines coming from different departments. And this is then reflected in this bias towards action. So you should better do something and hope that you learn something out of it instead of trying to overthink situations. So and this leads more or less to this philosophy of show, don't tell. So having real prototypes in your hand and then testing them quickly and early enough with your clients. And then be mindful of the process, especially when you reach higher implementation stages. The process is usually diminishing and getting less important as it is in the beginning. So as a beginner, you should try to stick to the process as good as you can, but the more guru you are, the less important the process is, because then you can pivot the process or you're doing on the go. Okay, so before we enter the Q&A session, maybe one final wish, especially for those who are working in large organizations. Just as a reminder, design thinking is seen in our lens or from our lens as a project method and not just as a workshop. So, and with that, I would like to open the Q&A session and hand back to Friederike.
Oh, thank you, Falk. Would you like to stop the screen sharing? So
sure.
I can see you a bit bigger. Perfect. So I'll just take it from the top. Quite a few people seem to want to know what are dark horse prototypes, because it was mentioned on a few slides.
Okay. So dark horse, yeah, interesting question. So the early phase, the diverging phase, we usually stage into different prototyping phases. The first one is called critical function prototyping phase, and the second one is called dark horse phase. What is the intention behind? The intention is that if I get a problem in the beginning and then I start prototyping, what I usually do is I just prototype the most obvious ideas that come to my mind. So we call these critical function prototypes. But the most obvious ideas are usually not the ones that have the highest creative potential. So therefore, we have introduced a second phase called dark horse. And the dark horse is basically the horse that you would never bet on, because the likelihood that this horse wins the horse race is almost zero. So that means in that phase, we are challenging the team to reframe all the assumptions that they have and restrictions that come from an organization in order to come up with very unlikely ideas. But these unlikely ideas, they help us to understand the real problem in a better way. So to give you one example, in the banking industry, you have a lot of restrictions from the policymakers, right? The BaFin, the FINMA are restricting your business for good reason, for sure. But it sometimes hinders people to become very creative. So they are stuck in their policy framework. And to help them to get out of it, out of their own comfort zone, we introduced the dark horse phase where we take away these constraints for a minute in the project in order to help them to think a bit beyond. For sure, for real implementation, we have to bring back the policies, and then the solution needs to fit into that domain again. But it helps to spark our own creativity in a much better way.
Thank you. The next question fits perfectly. How difficult is it to introduce design thinking and Scrum when there are regulated processes like in the pharmaceutical industry? What do you have to pay attention to when implementing?
Yeah, so good question. A lot of projects that have been done are in the pharmaceutical industry, so with all the major players. And what you need to differentiate are different areas in such an organization. On one hand side, you have the operations, right? And for sure, there you don't want to have any creativity left in the manufacturing floor. You don't want to have a drug failure because of someone being creative in the manufacturing floor. But then you have a lot of other areas like the R&D for digital related services that complement drugs. For example, for multiple sclerosis disease or for narcolepsy, you might be able to complement your drug portfolio with future digital services. So in here, you can definitely apply design thinking. And for sure, these digital solutions, they have to be CE compliant and they have to be compliant to FDA rules again as well, because they might become medical products, so digital medical products. But it should not hinder you in the beginning to use such a tool set like design thinking to explore what, for example, narcolepsy patients perceive as useful when it comes to digital services in regard to their disease. So it works, but it requires a clear understanding of the different parts of such a medical organization. The same applies for many other industries too.
Thank you. And is design thinking, in fact, just a new term for something that has always been at the basis of successful product development?
Yeah, it seemed like this in many ways. I mean, yes and no. What you should not get irritated with is just because you have identified one or two of the buzzwords like prototype or ideation, it does not mean that you do design thinking. So you might use some design thinking tools in your R&D process, and that's fine, that's okay. So, but design thinking, especially when you talk about the mindset, is a bit more. So it's not just the tools, it's also a certain way how you do the projects. And here, from my experience, corporates become usually too early, too inventive. So they try to innovate the process of design thinking even when they haven't understood it correctly. So that's a danger. And then on top, it's this mindset of also, yeah, using other organizational paradigms to set up teams, for example.
Thank you. As experts and advocates of design thinking, are you yourselves at risk of falling into the convergence trap after a long time focusing your research on? What are the alternatives to design thinking, which can be used to stimulate the why mindset in organizations?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we are all human beings, and I have to confess this as well. So it would be very risky to say that I'm not falling back into old paradigms. But therefore, I'm doing such speeches as well to get pushed and to get challenged. So I think what we are trying to do is, especially as colleagues at HBI and also as HSG, we are trying to challenge us constantly. So nothing is giving us for granted. So everything is under attack constantly, and this keeps us moving, and this also is helping us to listen to our customers, hopefully more often than the average. But for sure, we might fall into this risky problem as well. Yeah.
Thank you. How does one know how much divergence is really needed before you can start to focus again? It seems there's a big potential for spending lots of time and money with the risk of getting lost in the woods and potentially confusing stakeholders on the way.
Yeah. So I like the question, it's asked very often, but I would like to reframe it a bit, because I think it's not do one and then the other. But it's more doing both in parallel. So in the future, especially when you are an established organization without any digital footprint, I would recommend you to build up a team that is constantly exploring this design space and that is constantly using design thinking on wicked problems, and especially these uncharted territories where you have no knowledge in, and then constantly informing your implementation team. So you have to see it as part of your R&D that you have to do anyways. And for sure, it depends on the corporate strategy. I mean, if your company is deciding just to be a follower, then you might not need this because you're just following. But if you are the cutting edge robotic company, or if you are the cutting edge piping company like Georg Fischer, you might need to invest a constant amount of money and time into exploring it, and not just on a project base, but you have a constant team working on it.
Thank you. Some people want to understand better how does design thinking relate to agile. They seem to be common concepts, e.g. low fidelity prototype and MVP. You elaborated a bit. Can you talk a bit more about that?
I mean, Kent Beck and many others have written down the Agile Manifesto. And the manifesto is basically just describing the ingredients that the Agile methodology has to bring with. And if you read through the Agile Manifesto and compare it with design thinking, then design thinking classifies as an Agile method. The difference, what I tried to point out in my speech, is that most of the nowadays existing Agile methods are just converging methods. So they try to focus on what needs to be done and try to build a product. Design thinking, on the other hand, as an Agile method, is trying to understand the problem first. And therefore, it's so valuable to have both methods, Because if you look closely to Scrum, just as an example, Scrum always assumes that the product owner is knowing exactly the requirements. But what happens if the product owner has no clue about the problem space? What are you doing then? And this is where design thinking comes in. As a compatible agile methodology, it helps you or the product owners in such an organization to get a better understanding what they want to solve with a Scrum project.
Thank you. And can you give an example of such a wicked problem?
Oh, there are a lot of wicked problems. So for those who don't know the German translation, wicked is vertragtes Problem in German. So let's imagine you are working in an insurance company and your main portfolio component is automotive insurance. As you know from the news, automotive insurance might be taken over by the automotive industry. So at least with a certain likelihood. So from an insurance perspective, this would definitely worry me because as an insurer, I don't have access to cars usually. I don't have access to real-time data, but the car manufacturers have. So your existing traditionally established business is becoming in danger, getting in danger, and therefore also becoming a wicked problem, which you cannot solve easily anymore. Because most likely, if you're very honest to you, most likely you don't know the exact answer, what's coming after. So and then this, for example, would classify as a wicked problem. That also means if something is wicked or not depends on time. It might have been not wicked for the last 20 years, but with the rise of platforms or with the rise of new other digital possibilities, something might become super wicked.
Thank you. Is design thinking, does it essentially just bring marketing concepts into the product service design phase?
So as I said in the very beginnings, some concepts are borrowed from marketing. So there are definitely dedicated tools that have been trained for decades to marketing specialists. But I would say it's not just a pure marketing tool, by far not, because in marketing, what you usually don't do is prototyping, for example. You just don't do it. And at least I didn't see it, and I didn't see it in the literature as well. And also, you usually don't test your prototypes. So there are a lot more components, but for sure, since it's an interdisciplinary method, it contains marketing approaches too.
Thank you. And is design thinking something you do on an ongoing basis or ad hoc on a project to develop something specific? And perhaps in connection with that, does it need a special structure or structures, for example, such as Spotify and Scrum?
So we have been doing research about this, and it depends on the maturity level of an organization. So usually in the beginning, when organizations are not aware of this approach, and if they don't have any specialists in the organization working, they start typically with dedicated projects. So they do not set up a constant design thinking minded department, but they do projects just to learn. But in later stages, organizations, also the big tech companies, they have departments or teams applying the design thinking mindset. So I would not say they do design thinking step by step, but they look constantly at certain problems. They are constantly out in the field and they enhance the product development process with that knowledge. Yeah, so it depends on the maturity.
Thank you. We're getting towards our end, but we still have a few minutes. So I'm just trying to find good questions here. How can you enable the translation between R&D and the customers, especially if they don't speak the same languages and are very heterogeneous?
Yeah, excellent question. I think it also has to do with the learning progress. So for sure, in the beginning, if an organization is not familiar with doing such kind of field research, they might fail 1, 2, 3 times. But this is part of the project implementation process. But if they don't give up, if they push hard, even the most nerdy developers I've seen are then starting to adopt some of the customer language. So this is what we call empathy. So this is what you want, right? But for sure, the beginning is not easy, and you might have these weird moments when someone in the implementation department asks kind of crazy questions. But this needs to be seen not as a failure of the method, it's just part of the learning process. Therefore, such a transformation, like many other transformations as well, it takes time. We are not talking about a day or weeks, we are talking about 2, 3, 4 years sometimes.
Thank you. One last question, a good one from my view, and you're a professor at 2 universities. So how is this, or is design thinking being used in education? Schools are thinking about how to deal with digitalization. Could design thinking be used to deal with this challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is one large network called Sugar Network. So sugar like the candy network. If you Google it, you will find it quickly. It's the largest active design thinking network. And here we work every year together with more than 30 corporations from all over the world, trying to solve wicked problems. And we have done a lot of successes in the past. So a lot of young companies are started based on it, but also corporate products and also patents are every year released. So, I mean, for example, last year, together with my team, I had 6 projects, and only these 6 projects produced now 2 valuable patents, plus 3 startups. So for sure, it's not guaranteed that every project is a success, because then we wouldn't talk about innovation. But I see design thinking as a method that is increasing the likelihood that you find something that is of use and has a high novelty to the market.
Thank you. And of course, you can also learn it at the executive school, the methodology, and at various other places. Also, we have started developing programs with the design thinking method, which is also new for us. That's quite interesting. So yeah, thank you so much, Falk. There's still a few open questions, but I think we can still look at them afterwards. Some are asking for project examples, for example, and I'm sure we can put some in the
slide
follow-up next week.
Yeah.
Any final remarks you have, Falk?
Just one quick tip. So you could look at Vimcar, vimcar.de. It's the largest fleet manager in Germany. This has been one output out of our student projects even. So it was not a professional project in a way that we have been done it with a corporate, but with excellent students from our university network. And also Bladesign is another startup. So, but for sure, I will put some examples in the slide deck, and then you can look at it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, dear viewers, for staying on board for the whole hour. And if you enjoyed this, please also join our other webinars. There's still 4 more to come. Tonight at 5, what managers must know about business analytics. Quite a different angle to digitalization, but still an important one. So yeah, thank you, Falk. All the best to Potsdam, and get better, Jenny, in case you're watching. So I will end this meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.